Welcome to the debate. Before we get started, please make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and turn on the notification bell. Additionally, regarding the Martin Stevens versus OpenAI matter, we are currently in a voluntary quiet period. We just want to clarify that no settlement progress is known at this time, and we can confirm that the dead man switch has not been activated, meaning Martin is safe.
Right, exactly.
So, to jump right in, usually when we talk about commodity markets pricing and geopolitical risk, it's a bit like pricing in a hurricane. You see the storm forming on the horizon, you board up the windows, prices spike because of the impending threat, the storm hits, and then you rebuild. The risk premium eventually washes out.
Yeah, the storm passes, the sun comes out, and the market mean reverts to its baseline. I mean, it is a localized, temporary disruption that economic models can easily digest and recover from.
Exactly. But then you look at what is happening in the Gulf right now, and suddenly it feels less like a hurricane and more like the tectonic plates of the global energy market have fundamentally shifted beneath our feet. We aren't pricing in a passing storm anymore. On May 17, 2026, a drone strike specifically targeted the United Arab Emirates Barakah nuclear power plant, and the immediate market fallout was, well, it was visceral. Brent crude surged to $111.27 per barrel, and WTI climbed right behind it to $107.75.
Right. And that is the crux of what we are examining today, drawing directly from, current market reports, defense assessments, and geopolitical energy data. Because the central disagreement here is whether we are looking at a permanent paradigm shift or just a really severe, fear-driven overreaction.
Right. So does the targeting of the Barakah nuclear plant represent a fundamental, permanent structural shift in the global energy market's risk premium? Or is the subsequent price surge a temporary market overreaction compounding the ongoing Strait of Hormuz closure? I will argue that the attack establishes a new paradigm of nonlinear risk, proving that traditional mean-reverting geopolitical models are completely broken and a sustained structural price floor is now justified.
And I will argue that the market's reaction is a classic case of irrational hoarding driven by psychological fear, heavily overstating the physical supply threat while ignoring the proven resilience of regional air defenses and massive strategic inventory interventions.
Okay, so let's lay out exactly why this paradigm shift is real, because we have to look at the mechanics here, not just the headlines. The Barakah strike definitively alters how energy markets must price risk, because, frankly, you cannot look at it in a vacuum.
Sure.
It is occurring alongside an ongoing 80-day restriction on the Strait of Hormuz. We are talking about a maritime corridor that normally handles 20% of global energy supplies. That's up to 21 million barrels per day.
It's massive. Yeah.
Right. And now, hostile actors have targeted a $20 billion civilian nuclear facility. And keep in mind, Barakah was explicitly built to reduce the UAE's domestic natural gas dependence.
So they could export more.
Exactly. So they could export more hydrocarbons. By targeting this specific infrastructure, attackers have normalized an entirely new class of targets. When you combine this with models projecting global oil inventories to decrease by 2.6 million barrels per day this year, well, these triple-digit crude prices are not mere panic. They are a perfectly rational mathematical response to a structural constraint.
I come at it from a completely different way. The market is actually falling victim to what economists call the error of composition.
The crowded theater analogy.
Right. If you're listening to this and you aren't familiar with the term, the error of composition is what happens in a crowded theater when someone yells fire. For any individual person, running to the exit is the rational choice. But when everybody does it at exactly the same time, nobody gets out.
Yeah.
The resulting disaster is entirely self-inflicted. Traders right now are looking at the word nuclear, looking at the word drone, and individually running for the exits by hoarding oil futures. But look at the physical reality of the strike. The drone only hit an electrical generator outside the inner perimeter of the Barakah plant.
True, but
There was absolutely zero radiological release. There was no impact on the plant's essential cooling systems. The reactors are perfectly fine.
But the fact that they targeted it at all.
Well, wait, let me just finish this thought, because the market is completely ignoring the defense mechanisms here. The UAE operates a really successful, multi-layered air defense architecture. Since March 1st, they have successfully intercepted 96% of incoming threats. That is 172 of 186 ballistic missiles and over 750 drones successfully neutralized. Furthermore, the underlying physical supply of oil is being actively managed to stop this exact theater fire scenario. The IEA announced a historic 400 million barrel draw from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That SPR draw is mathematically designed to offset 20 full days of the Hormuz outage and dampen this exact type of psychological panic.
I get that. I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on the nature of this risk premium and why standard models are failing us here. You know, standard energy models are built to quantify physical supply interruptions.
Right.
A pipeline goes down, you lose X million barrels, you price that exact loss into the barrel, and the market moves on. But attacking civilian nuclear infrastructure removes the traditional ceiling on oil prices entirely. Standard models default to extreme risk aversion here because they simply cannot quantify the probability of a radiological event.
But the probability is incredibly low given the defenses.
But they can't price it in, nor can they price in the inevitable catastrophic military responses that would follow. How do you model the economic fallout of a radioactive cloud over the Persian Gulf? You can't. Therefore, the market has no choice but to embed a permanent structural premium just for the possibility.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. And we actually have a very recent historical precedent to prove exactly how this mechanism works.
Okay.
Look at the February 2025 drone strike on the Chernobyl new safe confinement structure. In that instance, a drone hit the actual sarcophagus covering the damaged reactor number 4.
Right, I remember that.
It caused a breach and a fire in the insulation. But what was the actual radiological outcome? 0. Background radiation didn't tick up a single microsievert. Exactly like the Chernobyl incident, the Barakah strike was designed for pure psychological terror and messaging. It offered 0 operational military advantage.
Well,
The attackers know full well they aren't going to cause a nuclear meltdown by hitting an outer electrical generator with a kamikaze drone. It is a theatrical performance designed to induce panic in trading algorithms and human portfolio managers, pricing global oil based on psychological terror rather than actual physical infrastructure damage is, by definition, a temporary market distortion.
Well, that's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The psychological terror actually is the market reality when it fundamentally breaks the forecasting models.
How so?
Let me offer an economic analogy grounded in our source material that explains the mechanism of what we're seeing. In textbook economics, theory assumes a frictionless world. Think of inventory as an economic shock absorber. Normally, there is an inverse correlation between inventory and price. If warehouses are full of oil, prices are low.
Right.
But the 1970s oil shocks physically broke those frictionless models. During those shocks, we saw a highly positive correlation between inventory and price, meaning inventory was high, but prices were skyrocketing anyway. Why? Because of justified hoarding. When consumers and nations fear that a good will become fundamentally unavailable in the future, they hoard it today.
Sure, hoarding happens, but
the normalization of strikes on nuclear facilities breaks modern energy forecasting in the exact same way. The hoarding we are seeing right now isn't an error of composition. It is entirely rational when the threat vector is existential. If you believe the Strait of Hormuz might actually stay closed, and the region might descend into a war involving nuclear facilities, holding on to every single barrel of oil you have is the most logical thing a market participant can do.
I mean, that assumes the physical constraints are actually as dire as the market fears, but they aren't. Yes, hoarding happens, that's human nature, but the Strategic Petroleum Reserve draw is the exact mechanical tool designed to break that positive correlation you just described.
Is it enough, though?
the whole thinking behind the creation of SPRs in the aftermath of those 1970s shocks was to ensure the public availability of physical supply, to dampen the desire to hoard. You're looking at the SPR draw like it's supposed to permanently replace production. It's not.
But it's like using a massive fire extinguisher on a grease fire. It deprives the panic of the oxygen it needs to justify triple-digit prices. We are looking at the largest combined draw in history, 400 million barrels. That injects deep liquidity right into the heart of the panic.
But you have to look at the scale of the fire. That 400 million barrels only offsets 20 days of the Hormuz restriction. The Strait normally sees 20 million barrels per day transit through it. If the restriction goes past 20 days, and remember we are already at day 80 of shipping restrictions, that SPR buffer evaporates completely.
But the SPR draw isn't operating in isolation. But we have to look at the compounding physical constraints happening right now. The Barakah attack isn't happening in a vacuum. It is happening while 10.5 million barrels per day were shut in during April across Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain.
Right.
For our listeners, a shut-in happens when the storage tanks are full because the ships can't move through the strait, so the producers literally have to cap the oil wells. It restricts the actual physical flow of barrels to the market.
Yeah, but shut-ins are fundamentally temporary. They are a symptom of a logistical backlog, not a permanent loss of geological production capacity. Once the shipping lanes clear, those wells are uncapped.
But it takes time to safely uncap them without damaging the reservoir. And during that time, the market is starving for supply. And look at the structural changes in OPEC that compound this. The UAE just announced its departure from OPEC effective May 1st, 2026.
Right.
Because the UAE held a significant amount of the bloc's spare capacity, our models now expect OPEC's spare capacity to average just 2.5 million barrels per day in 2027. That is down massively from previous forecasts of 3.8 million barrels per day. So let's tally this up. You have an 80-day restriction on the world's most vital maritime choke point, 10.5 million barrels per day of shut-in production, structural spare capacity dropping to 2.5 million barrels, and decentralized drones targeting nuclear plants. The market has absolutely no buffer left if this conflict expands even slightly. That completely justifies Brent at $112.
Look, that is a compelling argument, but have you considered the broader macro energy buffer that exists outside the Gulf?
What do you mean?
Well, the oil market does not operate in an isolated vacuum separate from other energy commodities. If you're listening, you might wonder why we are talking about American natural gas when there is an oil crisis in the Middle East. It's because of energy substitution.
Okay.
While the market hyper-focuses on the Strait of Hormuz, traders are completely ignoring domestic U.S. production metrics. U.S. marketed natural gas production averaged over 122.2 billion cubic feet per day in the first quarter of this year. That is up 4% from the same period last year.
Right. But
Furthermore, U.S. LNG liquefied natural gas export capacity is growing significantly. We just saw the first shipment from Golden Pass LNG's Train 1, and additional output from Corpus Christi Stage 3 in April.
I hear you, but natural gas is not a one-to-one substitute for crude oil in the short term, especially in the global transportation sector. You can't just suddenly pump natural gas into a diesel cargo ship or an airliner.
Not in the short-term transportation sector, no. But in the macroeconomic picture, natural gas abundance provides a massive energy buffer for the industrial and power generation sectors globally. It acts as a pressure release valve. It prevents a total systemic energy collapse.
I mean, sure, it helps the power grid.
Right, and if we look at the apocalyptic oil price models projecting $150 or more per barrel, those models mathematically assume a total inelasticity of demand, meaning they assume that no matter how high the price goes, consumers will still be forced to buy the exact same amount of oil because they have zero alternatives.
Yeah.
The U.S. natural gas and LNG expansion completely undermines that apocalyptic scenario. Heavy industry in Europe and Asia can pivot to utilizing more LNG for power and manufacturing, reducing their aggregate baseline demand for oil. The physical oil supply is constrained, yes, but the global economy has structural alternatives that simply didn't exist during the 1970s oil shocks.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, honestly, because it fundamentally underestimates the mechanics of proxy warfare in the Gulf today. Let's pivot to how deterrence actually works, or rather, how it is failing. Iran's use of proxy forces, like the Houthis in Yemen and militias in Iraq, creates an asymmetric warfare environment where traditional geopolitical deterrence completely breaks down.
How so?
If a sovereign state like the U.S. or Israel strikes another state actor, there are established diplomatic and military protocols. There are red lines. But proxies operate in a gray zone. They launch a drone that costs maybe $20,000, and it directly threatens a $20 billion nuclear facility.
Right, but
As long as just one drone can slip through to strike a target like Barakah, the market has no choice but to maintain a high-risk floor. Conventional diplomacy cannot neutralize this threat vector. You cannot sign a non-proliferation treaty with a decentralized proxy network that guarantees the safety of Gulf energy infrastructure. Therefore, Brent crude is going to be stuck in this $90 to $110 band indefinitely. The threat is permanent because the actors are unaccountable.
you're highlighting the one drone that slipped through, but you're willfully ignoring the massive data set of technical resilience. Let's look at the mechanics of those interception numbers again. Since March 1st, the UAE air defense systems have intercepted 172 out of 186 ballistic missiles. They have shot down 755 out of 812 drones.
Right.
That is an interception rate of roughly 96%. Do you know how incredibly advanced a multi-layered air defense architecture has to be to achieve a 96% success rate against a saturated swarm attack?
But 4% still got through, and one literally hit a nuclear plant.
It hit an electrical generator outside the inner perimeter, and that is the crucial operational distinction. The defense systems are purposefully designed to prioritize the most critical catastrophic targets. The core reactors were perfectly protected.
Well,
The fact that the UAE can maintain a 96% interception rate demonstrates a highly effective, deeply integrated regional defense strategy. It shows that they have successfully transitioned from relying solely on external protection, like the U.S. military umbrella, to building a resilient domestic defense network. Traders are currently pricing in a catastrophic worst-case scenario regarding Gulf infrastructure that the UAE's defense systems are empirically proving every single day that they can prevent.
but doesn't the fact that they have to intercept over 800 drones in just a few months prove my exact point? The operating environment is fundamentally hostile. It doesn't matter if you have the world's greatest umbrella if it's raining acid every single day. Eventually, the market has to price in the structural cost of trying to conduct business in that environment.
I wouldn't say the cost is structural to that degree.
And going back to the mechanism of the SPR draw, if nations releasing their strategic petroleum reserves decide to keep that oil within their own borders, due to domestic political fears, prices will actually continue to rise globally. The taxpayers who funded that storage must be willing to share with nations that did not. In a geopolitical environment where cheap drones are routinely targeting nuclear plants, do you really think we will see seamless, altruistic international sharing of strategic petroleum reserves?
The mechanism of the SPR is coordinated by the IEA precisely to manage that distribution securely. And again, look at the nature of the target and the response of the people actually living there. When you look at the 2025 Chernobyl drone strike, the international community realized it was an act of intimidation, not a tactical military maneuver.
Right.
The European Union formally defines this kind of state-sponsored terrorism as acts intended to intimidate a population or coerce governments. It is a psychological tool. The UAE understands this implicitly. They recognize that the strike is meant to send a message to the Emiratis: we can touch your crown jewel. But the UAE didn't shut down the Barakah plant.
No, they didn't.
All units are operating normally as we speak. The Federal Authority for Nuclear Regulation confirmed everything is completely stable. If the host nation of the targeted nuclear plant isn't panicking and shutting down its own power grid, why on earth should global oil traders panic and price crude at $112 a barrel? It's an irrational overreaction driven by algorithmic sentiment analysis, not physical reality.
Yes, it is not irrational if the fundamental structure of the market has lost its elasticity. Let's look at the math one more time, because the math is what ultimately drives the physical delivery of barrels. We are facing a projected global oil inventory decrease of 2.6 million barrels per day this year.
Yes.
That is a massive revision from the 0.3 million barrel decrease projected just a month prior. Why the sudden revision? Because the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed to normal commercial traffic, and the recovery period for all that shut-in oil production in the Middle East is taking much longer than anticipated.
Right, but
When you have a macro environment where spare capacity is structurally shrinking down to 2.5 million barrels per day for OPEC, and physical inventories are drawing down at a rate of 2.6 million barrels per day, the price mathematically has to rise to destroy demand. That is textbook economics. The Barakah strike was just the catalyst that forced a complacent market to wake up and look at the physical math. The risk premium isn't just about the psychological fear of a drone strike, it's about the very real, quantifiable possibility that we simply will not have enough physical barrels to meet global demand by the fourth quarter.
Look, I don't dispute the math on the inventory draws, but you have to contextualize it within the broader economic response mechanism. High prices are the ultimate cure for high prices. At $112 a barrel, you are going to see massive demand destruction in emerging markets. You are going to see a rapid, forced acceleration in alternative fuel adoption.
Sure.
And you're going to see producers entirely outside the Middle East maximize every single drop of output they can manage to capture that premium. The market will balance itself. The current price spike is driven by the immediate visceral shock of the word nuclear being placed next to the word drone in a news ticker. It triggers an immediate emotional response from automated trading algorithms and human portfolio managers alike.
Yeah, I see your point.
But when the dust settles and the market collectively realizes that Barakah is still safely generating power and the UAE's air defenses are holding the line at 96%, that psychological premium will absolutely evaporate.
Okay, well, as we bring this discussion to a close, I will summarize my position. The combination of an unprecedented 80-day closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a massive 2.6 million barrel per day structural deficit in global inventories, and the unprecedented targeting of a civilian nuclear plant fundamentally rewrites the rules of geopolitical energy risk. We are no longer dealing with episodic, mean-reverting disruptions. We are dealing with a permanent shift in the asymmetric threat landscape. Therefore, a sustained structural price premium, keeping crude in the triple digits, is entirely justified by the underlying physical data.
And my conclusion is that while the situation is undeniably tense geopolitically, the physical reality on the ground tells a distinctly different story. The Barakah strike resulted in zero structural damage and absolutely no radiological release. When you combine the UAE's empirically proven 96% air defense interception rate with the massive 400 million barrel SPR interventions and the pressure release valve of rising U.S. natural gas production, it proves the current oil rally is driven by psychological hoarding rather than a permanent paradigm shift. The market is currently pricing in fear, not physics.
You know, I think where we do find absolute convergence today is acknowledging just how historically anomalous this 80-day restriction of the Strait of Hormuz really is. We are in completely uncharted waters regarding maritime energy transit and the global supply chain. And we also entirely agree that the introduction of nuclear facilities as targets in proxy warfare represents a deeply concerning psychological escalation in the region, regardless of whether the drones physically breach the reactors.
Absolutely. The weaponization of that psychological fear through asymmetric proxy warfare is a new variable that we haven't seen deployed quite this effectively before, and it complicates the forecasting landscape immensely.
Yeah, it really is incredibly complex to separate actual physical supply metrics from geopolitical fear in modern commodity markets. So, to see which reality ultimately takes hold, our listeners will need to continue closely monitoring international diplomatic responses, the actual flow and distribution of those SPR inventory levels, and whether that 96% defense interception rate can be maintained over the long term against increasingly sophisticated swarm tactics. Are we just boarding up the windows for a particularly nasty passing storm? Or have the tectonic plates of the global energy market truly shifted beneath our feet? Only time and the physical data will tell.
Very true.
Thank you for joining us. Please remember to like, subscribe, follow, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update.